Jasper frowned as he read over the letter, the summons looking like no other mail he'd ever received. On Saturday, you are summoned to attend midnight visitation as part of your rehabilitation. Attendance is non-negotiable, and refusal will result in forced attendance, followed by time spent in solitary. Be ready by no later than 11. The Warden. Whoa, that's pretty cool, said Gavin, reading over his shoulder. Who do you know that would come all the way down here at midnight to see you? Jasper didn't know, and he told him as much. He was in here for killing the last person who'd given a crap about him, and he couldn't think of anyone who would make the trip in the daytime, let alone at night. His parents had disowned him after he'd killed her, and most of his family refused to have anything to do with him. Some of his cousins would still accept his letters, but few of them would bother to write back. Jasper was perplexed by the invitation, but by the sound of it, it wasn't much of an invitation anyway. Attendance seemed to be mandatory, and he was pretty sure that most of the guards on the compound would enjoy dragging him there in chains. The letter had come with their mail, and it was one of the few times the guard had called his name. The last year and a half had been difficult for Jasper, but he was getting used to making it on his own. He'd done it all his life, hadn't he? His mom and dad had been too busy with their own things to care about their middle child. Barbara was the smart one, Reggie was the athletic people person, and Jasper was the screw-up. His grades had never been too good, his achievements few and far between, and when Grace had come into the picture, his parents figured it was the best Jasper could do. Jasper had agreed with them. Grace had been everything from the moment she agreed to go steady with him. Grace was motivated, a natural saleswoman who had strived for something more than middle management. She had a successful business by the time she graduated college, and Jasper was happy to stay at home and keep the house. Jasper provided her with stability, someone to come home to who lacked the means to do any better. But he couldn't give her the one thing she wanted. That's why she left him. That's why he'd had to kill her. He couldn't stand to be apart from her, couldn't stand for her to be with somebody else. And now, he was stuck in Stragview for his lapse in judgment. That's what made the note so cryptic, and the longer he thought about it, the shorter the list of people who would come all the way here at night became. He did a little more than wait, he supposed. Jasper asked around about the midnight visitation, but no one seemed to know much about it. The younger guys all shook their heads, and the older guys clammed up when you asked about it. It was like a magic spell had been cast over the whole thing, and when you asked some of these guys, it seemed to sap the life right out of them before your eyes. Garth, one of the more gregarious murderers on Jasper's block, had looked downright scared when he'd asked him about the visitation. "I can't say nothing," Garth said, "and neither will you once you go. It's a secret that you keep after that. It's something that changes you, and you keep going back till it does." What changes you?" Jasper had asked, but Garth wouldn't say any more. "Get away from me. Get away before he thinks I told you." He left in a hurry then, their chess game only 4 moves in, and Jasper found he had more questions than before. He supposed that all would be answered on Saturday, and as the days passed, he found himself a little excited about the whole idea of the thing. When Saturday night arrived, Officer Gage found him in his bunk, his best uniform still looking ragged as he waited for whatever might come. Gage held out a pair of cuffs, telling Jasper that he'd have to cuff him before he left. Jasper nodded, putting his hands behind his back, but Gage told him it was in the front this time. Jasper shrugged. It was his show, and let him cuff him in the front. Some of the guys who were still awake made suggestive noises as he left, some of them telling him to enjoy his night visit, but the older guys were noticeably quiet. Gage led him to the visitation area, a little spot behind staff check-in, and when Jasper shook the cuffs at him, Gage told him to sit down and put his hands on the eye hook on the table. There were a few guys in here, some of them Jasper knew, but most he didn't. and they all seemed to be cuffed to the protruding hook in the center of the table. Jasper started to buck, but realized it wouldn't do any good. Whatever this was, they'd have him, one way or another. He set his hands on the table, and Gage pulled a lock out of his pocket. He secured Jasper to the spot before leaving him in an all-fired hurry. Whatever was about to happen, Gage clearly didn't want any part of it. Jasper glanced around the room, taking in the men that sat around him. There were about 12 in all of them shackled to the table, and they were all spaced so that at least 3 chairs separated them from one another. Most of them looked confused or unsure, but a couple of them looked like they knew what was coming, knew and weren't looking forward to it. One of them, a big bald bruiser named Dennis, had his head against the table as he cried nakedly between his elbows. Another, who Jasper didn't know, was praying in fast Spanish. A third, Jasper thought his name might be Conroy, was thrashing around as he pulled at his bonds. His eyes were roving like a scared horse, and he kept pulling at his cuffs until he heard a lock click near the back of the room. Then he went still, and Jasper thought he saw him listening for something. A pair of double metal doors at the back of the room burst open then, and Jasper saw a small group walk in, unattended by guards. 2 of them were children, a pair of twins who looked ghostly under the dim fluorescent. One was a dark woman who sat down in front of the man who prayed. The last was a tall, homely woman who took the seat across from a younger inmate that Jasper couldn't put a name to. The young man stiffened as she sat down, and the pair were close enough that Jasper could suddenly see the woman's problem wasn't her face, but rather what was on it. She had a crop of mold growing from ear to ear, and as it wove around her eyes, it made it look like she were wearing glasses. "Hello, Emmanuel," she said, her voice thick, but not unhappy to see him. "I see prison has suited you." "The hell is this?" Emmanuel said, trying to back away and failing as the chains caught him. "You ain't real. You look like my ma, but you ain't my ma." "Course I am, Em. How else would I know how you drowned me in the bathtub? How else would I know what you did to me before you buried me in the basement? How else would I know how much you cried before you turned yourself in? You could feel me watching you from the corner of the room, and it ate at you until you just couldn't take it anymore. The way..." She leaned a little closer, looking at him mischievously, "that you ate at me after I was gone." The inmate started making a sound like someone choking on air. He kept pulling away from the woman, but the chains brought him up yet again. Jasper looked away, but he could see similar scenes of horror unfolding around him as more people joined them. The twins sat down in front of the sobbing man, but he wouldn't lift his head. He wouldn't look at them, couldn't look at them. But the longer Jasper looked, the more he could see the bruises around their necks. The deep, purple marks looked like individual fingers, and they seemed incapable of speaking through their bruised throats. They sat menacingly across from him, and every peek he gave them was followed by a hopeless cry of terror. Others came, men, women, children, mothers, fathers, wives, everything in between. The inmates' reactions were as varied as the specters. One man could only repeat the phrase, "I'm sorry," as a half-naked boy of 17 sat silently across from him. The mother and son he had seen first were now sitting with her hands on his as he rocked and shook his head in negation. What could only be an older man's parents asked if he were proud of what he'd done to them, but he only sat silently and stared right through them. Jasper wondered when it would be his turn, but he didn't have long to ponder. "Sorry I'm late, dear. The commute was dreadful. His breath came out as little more than a puff of smoke, and when he turned to look at her, Jasper could tell that it was Grace only by the necklace she wore. He'd given her that necklace for their 3rd anniversary, and he supposed her parents had left it on her when they buried her. Her face, a face he had loved so much, was gone. She looked like a burn victim, like a used-up matchstick, and the eyes that looked back at him glowed from empty sockets. Jasper wanted to scream, wanted to pull away, as her red and oozing hands came out to touch his, but he couldn't muster the strength. She was burnt, her beauty stolen in death, and that was his fault. After he'd blindsided her, begging for another chance, she had told him to get lost. She said she couldn't be with someone who wouldn't give her children, and suggested that he go back to his mom's house before her new boyfriend found them together. At the mention of her new boyfriend, he grabbed her by the neck and turned away, slamming her head against the wall of the stairwell outside her apartment. He had kept right on doing this until she stopped struggling, and even then, he did it a few more times. He only stopped when her head began to dribble something besides blood, and he realized he'd broken her skull. He was scared then, afraid that he would get caught, and when he put her in his car, he wasn't sure what he intended to do with her. The police had caught him in his parents' backyard, one of their neighbors having seen the whole thing, but by then, Grace had been a charcoal briquette. He'd heard the funeral had been closed casket, but apparently they hadn't closed it tight enough. "What's wrong, dear? Didn't you tell me you couldn't live without me? I believe it was a little bit before you smashed my head against the wall. I assumed that since you'd taken all that time to burn me, that you wanted me to look this way. Well, have a look, Jasper. See what you've done to your Grace." Every word she spoke sent flakes of her tongue and lips onto the table, onto his hands, onto Jasper's face. She was leaning in closer, bringing her horrible visage closer to his, and Jasper felt his sanity beginning to whimper. As she brought the remains of her blackened lips together, he added his scream to the others. As they pressed against his flesh, he let his eyes roll up to the whites. He tried to stay conscious, but the sheer horror of the situation was eroding his mind. This couldn't be. Things like this weren't real. Grace was dead. She couldn't come back to torment him. As he regained consciousness, he found that he was still chained to the table, and terrible Grace was still sitting across from him. "You seem to have gotten a little sleepy, my love. That's okay. The warden was nice enough to extend visitation for the whole night, and I was more than happy to come see my best fella." Jasper screamed until his throat broke, and when Gage opened the door at 5 o'clock, all those present were silent as the grave. Gage led them away like a flock of lambs, easily correcting them when they tried to stumble out of line. He'd been doing this for a while, 2 or 3 years at least, and he learned not to question what went on behind that door. He heard begging, heard screaming, heard the mad laughter of the deranged. And at the end of the month, he found an extra $500 added to his check for every midnight visitation he conducted. His smile curdled when he remembered what the warden had said to him when he gave him the position. "I know you're struggling to feed your appetites, and it's only a matter of time before you end up inside these walls for doing something foolish. Why not let me help you feed those urges, and in exchange, I won't tell anyone what sort of debauchery you get up to in your spare time." The warden was a weird one, but Gage had to admit he had always kept his promises. Gage wondered what he put those poor saps through, but quickly put it out of his mind. The warden's games were none of his concern, and how he chose to discipline his inmates was his business. You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them, shall we? Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet and Lady Vengeance for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, come on down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you best. I always recommend the Ghostly Reader tier, since you get a signed book anytime I write one on your doorstep. But I have many tiers, and again, I'm sure you'll find one to suit you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.